Welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn series. My name is Christine Moorman, and I'm a faculty member in the marketing area here at the Fuqua School of Business. I'm also the founder and director of the CMO survey, which I've been running here since 2008. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share a set of results from a special COVID-19 edition of the CMO survey that we ran in May. So I'll present for about 15 minutes or so, and then I can take your questions, which you can enter as comments into this LinkedIn post. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. So these are the topics that I will cover with you today. There's a lot of information available in the reports. So what I'll do is I will cut across these 5 critical topics and share with you just a few key results that I think you might find interesting and helpful in your work. So I will tell you that, just to kind of give you a bigger picture on the survey, that you can see that this is a survey that was based on 274 marketing leaders at for-profit US companies, most of which were 97% that were VP or higher. And we cut across sectors, both industry sectors and economic sectors, as well as size. And so many of you might have questions about your particular sector. I'm not going to have an opportunity to get into those in detail, but what I can tell you is that you can download, review, and use all of the reports, which are made freely available to you at the website here listed at the top of the page. So if you just go to cmosurvey.org, you'll see the results page. All of these reports, including one report that takes every single result and breaks it out by those different characteristics that I just showed to you. You'll also have a chance there to sign up to participate if you qualify to be part of the survey. So let's jump in on customer behavior, because of course, customer behavior changed dramatically during this pandemic. And there's a couple key results here that I think are worth pointing out to you. So first, when we look at, we ask marketers to let us know where, what kinds of consumer behaviors were changing, which were frequent and infrequent. And what you can see here on the left is a set of frequent consumer behaviors, things that they reported were changing quite a bit. And of course, lower in-person activities makes a lot of sense. And then correspondingly, the focus on digital. So there was a great deal of shifting as consumers continued to try to engage in the marketplace in a variety of ways. Openness to digital offerings, increased value placed on digital experiences. What I think is also important about this slide is to look at what were in this sort of infrequent customer behaviors. So we don't see a drop-off in terms of willingness to pay. We don't see a drop-off in terms of loyalty levels. These were things that we might have expected would suffer during the pandemic, but they have not. There was, of course, as we see in the middle, there was some reduction in terms of lower likelihood to buy, but not nearly as high as some of the other frequent consumer behaviors. Looking at when, kind of in a forward-looking sense, when will these customer behaviors return to pre-pandemic levels? What you should take away from this slide, I think, are 2 things. First, in the bottom row, look at the degree to which marketers said that the increased value placed on digital experiences, they never, the largest percentage, believe that that will never return to pre-pandemic levels. So this appears to be something that marketers think is kind of a turn to a new normal for customers. But then looking at all of the other factors, we didn't ask about all customer behaviors and when they would return to normal, but we did ask about a couple of key behaviors around likelihood to buy, purchasing at full price, loyalty. Marketers expect that those will return within 6 to 12 months. And so I think that's good news in terms of what we expect to be happening going forward. And then finally, looking at this slide, this is a question that we've been asking really from the beginning, and I'm showing you data here from February of 2009 all the way through the most recent survey, which happened in February 2020, and then this most recent survey, which happened just last month. And what we do is we ask marketers, what are your customers' top 3 priorities? And we give them these 5 options. And so I think there's a couple things that you want to note about this slide. First, the emphasis on trusting relationship has increased 47% from February of 2009, from this 19.9% up to 29.3%, to be the most important factor among consumers. It was the most important factor in the prior survey. It's even more important now. And so that's something I think for you to think about. What does a trusting relationship look like from my business perspective? What can we do to further that sense, to build that trust with customers? At the same time, we see at the end of this, at the tail end of this slide, a reduction in the focus on low price. So that same 47%, now we see a 49% reduction from, at least from February of 2009 down to February of 2020. It has, of course, increased since the pandemic as budgets tighten, but it still is not the most important factor to consumers, which appears to be this focus on trusting relationship. So that's what we have on customer behavior. Let's look at what marketers did during the pandemic. And so what we did here is we asked marketers, what activities did you shift your resources to during the pandemic? And then I bucketed these in this slide into 3 groups. Group that was sort of strongly prioritized by marketers, then weakly, and then deprioritized. And sort of following from the strong digital focus that customers had, marketers responded, as you can see, by building better digital interfaces for consumers, thinking about transforming how they go to market to meet consumers in these digital spaces and to provide more value. So that really was the key emphasis of their strategies. I'm going to return to the focus on some of these weekly prioritized activities that I think that were probably missed opportunities for marketers. So let's come back to that. But I think for now, I think we can safely say that the emphasis really was on digital activities. And at the same time, when we asked about the sort of objectives that marketers had, what we can see here is that there were really 2 that rose to the surface: building brand value that connects with customers and retaining current customers. And contrast that with customer acquisition, which we see down here, or increasing customer awareness of the brand, or even improving marketing ROI. So the focus, which I'll characterize as later, sort of staying within the funnel, really thinking about, how do we make our customers continue to stay with us, building that connection with them. Then we also asked, how is it that you're using your marketing employees during COVID? And it, very consistent with those overarching objectives. The focus was really on, getting online, reaching out to the current customers with information, improving our digital interfaces. So one of the things that we have been charting since, really since the very beginning of the survey, I'm just showing you here from February 2015 to date, is the amount of spending that companies put into social media, which is a big piece of their digital strategy. And what you can see here is that number has increased over time. But from February of 2020 to June 2020, which was sort of the 2 months that the survey happened in May, we see a huge increase from 13.3% of budgets up to 23.2%. And as you can see by the slide label there at the top, this was a 74% increase. And it's also expected to be sort of maintained over the next year. Now, the boycott, all of the things that are going on right now with Facebook and some of the other social media activities will likely threaten this. But nevertheless, it was very interesting and very consistent to see that marketers sort of put their shoulder behind social media as a way to increase their digital presence. And not only did they spend, but as this graph shows, they also were able to see a performance lift. This is a number, this is a 7-point scale that we've been asking marketers about in terms of to what degree has the use of social media contributed to your company's performance during the pandemic, or we ask it in general. In this case, we asked about it during the pandemic, 1 through 7. And as you can see on the right-hand slide over here, I show you from 2019 and February 2020 that these numbers have been low, but if I showed you over time an even more longitudinal view, you would see that these numbers have been 3.2, 3.3, et cetera, for really about 4 or 5 years. They have not budged, despite the fact that we see all of this spending. But really, for the very first time, we see a lift in this number. Now, it's not 5, 6, or 7, which would be, of course, better. But in this particular case, we do see a lift from the rating of 3.4 up to 4.2. So social media does seem to have offered more benefits to performance for companies. And then kind of owing to the fact that customer behavior shifted, marketers were essentially sort of put on the front line to triage here, whereas a lot of other parts of the company didn't really have a role to play. We can see that the importance of marketing has actually increased since COVID-19. That's overall at 62.3%. And if you look at the economic sectors, which I show you there on the side, you can see that B2B actually, those companies benefited even more than the B2C. Okay, in terms of marketing jobs, I'll just show you a couple key slides here. First, what we see is that this is a depiction of what percent of marketing jobs in your company were lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what you can see here is that the average is 9.2%. So 9.2% of marketing jobs were lost. But the modal response, the most common response here at 62%, I think is also telling. So we have this long tail of loss. In some cases, all of the marketing department was lost. But really the most common response was no change in headcount among marketers. And when we ask about when they expect these jobs to return, the largest percentage, 24%, don't expect those jobs to return. And so, you could think about this in a number of ways. Digital may require fewer people. And I've also talked to some marketing leaders who've said that, maybe their headcount was a little on the higher side. And so the pandemic allowed them to sort of get right-sized, if you will. And then in terms of future growth, marketers do not expect to be hiring in the next year. We see this very large drop-off relative to the historical trend of this question, down to negative 3.5%. Okay, and in terms of marketing performance, I'm going to quickly show you just a few slides on performance and a few slides on spending for marketing that I think are really important for you. So first, remember we talked about the fact that consumers were shifting, obviously, to digital. Marketers were moving in that direction too. So I think it's interesting then to see, and very consistent to see, that the percent of sales that the company had through the internet really rose and took off in a big way over these last few months. It's a number that, frankly, I've always looked at it over time and thought, why is that number not getting any bigger? And we even wrote a Forbes blog about it, which you can go and look at, because it was very curious to us why there weren't higher sales through the internet. And this is corroborated by other evidence that we see out there among companies. But really, 19.3% suggests that firm sales did increase. Now, obviously, face-to-face sales, in-person sales, brick-and-mortar sales, that went down. But this percentage, I think, is telling in terms of the shift that we've been describing. And overall, when we think about the impact on sales, and I'm only going to show you sales. If you want to see the rest of the effect on profits and customer acquisition, you can look at those in the report. They're very consistent, not as dramatic. This is the most dramatic figure, which shows that about a loss of about 17.8% in sales revenue occurred. And from what I've been reading in other sources, this is very consistent with what we see out there, sort of between 10 and 20%, depending on the sector. Marketers do expect that that will be made up within the next year, as you can see with this bottom graph here in terms of the forward-looking indicators. And then finally, just looking at marketing spending, that I think really might be helpful to you. So what we did here was we're depicting basically what percent of your marketing budget has been lost or gained due to COVID in the prior 2 months. So that would have been basically March and April, and then whenever they answered the survey in May. What you can see is that overall, there were actually that marketing, the overall average was about a 5.2% budget increase. Okay, and that's very consistent again with all of the different facets of the survey that have come together. But there were clearly winners and losers. About 41% of the companies gained, 30% didn't have any change, and then 28.4% or so suffered a loss. Okay, and then looking forward again, the majority of companies expect those budgets to return to quote unquote normal in about 6 to 12 months. And then finally, this is a figure that I always pay close attention to, and I have a lot of executives pay attention to this, as well as analysts trying to value companies. So what we're looking at here is the percent of the firm's overall budget that marketing accounts for. That's in the top. And then basically the percent of the marketing sales that marketing expenses account for what percent of the firm revenues. So they're both percentages that give us meaningful insight into these companies, because most marketers are first not going to tell us what their marketing budgets are, but they will give us a sense of how they compare to the overall budget and to the overall firm revenues. And what we see is a clear lift to really the highest levels that we've seen in the CMO survey history, levels that increased even since February of 2020, and point to the fact that even though revenues were dropping, firm budgets were likely dropping, marketing budgets didn't drop at that same rate. Otherwise, we would have seen these numbers sort of flat from February of 20. Okay, so that's what I have in terms of the slides that I want to share. And so maybe let me unshare my screen, and then I can take some questions for you or from you in the time that we have. Remember, you can add those to the comment section here on LinkedIn, and then happy to address those with you. So here's one question. I discussed, I think for the most part, some of the opportunities that marketing seemed to have during the pandemic. Were there things that marketing missed? And I mentioned that, when I was talking about the different things that were prioritized and not prioritized, I think there were a couple things that really stood out to me. First, when I think about marketing, I always think about the most important thing that marketing can help companies do is grow. This is its bread and butter. It's the way in which we really add value as both a process and a function within organizations. But if you look at that what was weekly prioritized, it's interesting that marketers put a lot of emphasis on digital, but they didn't put a lot of emphasis into expanding into new offerings. That was only 42% compared to the digital, which was in the 50s and 60s. And then also building partnerships were not given much emphasis. And so, I think that there was a much bigger opportunity here, maybe for some companies and some industries to think about invention often occurs during times of constraint. Necessity is the mother of invention. And so you also have employees, at least in some companies, that weren't able to enact their roles. And so they could perhaps have been turned to consider things like new product and service opportunities or new partnership opportunities. In fact, less than 31% of companies prioritize using employees for partnerships, and less than 16%, less than 45% prioritized employees to generate product and service ideas. Some sectors really stood out. Tech really stood out on both of these, and they did both of these incredibly well. So that would be one thing that I would point to. Okay, here's another question from, and thank you, Sandy, for that first question. Another question here from Rajesh. We mentioned, I talked about the loss of marketing jobs, but has the pandemic changed the types of marketers that companies might be interested in hiring? So that's a really good question. It's a question that we actually did ask about in the survey. We asked folks to think about the answer to this question, thinking about their future marketing talent needs, whenever those were to occur. Basically, what skills would you prioritize? And given we were in the middle of the pandemic when we put the survey together, we added a few answers to this question that we thought would be helpful in understanding whether a different set of skills might be valued. And as it turned out, the number one skill that was ranked by marketing leaders as important, and all of the future MBA students, or maybe even my former PhD MBA students, please listen to this. That number one skill is the ability to pivot as new priorities emerge. So I think this idea of really being able to shift and be agile, be flexible, is important. I mean, the pandemic really called for that. I think even as a business school, it's something that we need to think about. I know that I'm going to be teaching a new course in entrepreneurial mindset, and I'm thinking with my co-teacher, Manuel, Adelina, about, well, how do we actually encourage people to develop this skill? What does that look like? And how can we foster that? So I think that's something for companies to consider deeply. And I would say that one constraint against that is that we saw training and development budgets also drop during the pandemic. And this is pretty common, that we see that this is an area where companies tend to cut back when times get tough. So if the ability to pivot is something that they want to foster among their employees, both those coming in and their current employees, it's probably something that they'll have to work to spend against. So let's see here. So Katie has a question. What types of information did marketers rely on during the pandemic to help them make decisions? That's a good question. I think we have something here around, so yeah, we did in fact ask something about this. So let me just turn to that so I can share with you the data. So we asked basically, what kind of information did you use to guide your marketing strategies? Because we know that marketers, we asked in the survey, did you have plans? And most of them on a 7-point scale rated themselves about a 3. So most marketers didn't seem to have much of a plan to deal with the pandemic, which makes sense. And so they were stuck kind of improvising and developing some plans on the fly. So using information to help guide that, I think, is really important. So we asked, what kinds of things did you rely on? What types of input did you take? And what was interesting, and this is sort of a missed opportunity as well, what we see is that they predominantly focused on what I would call internal advice. Like 83% of them focused on their marketing team members. And 81% focused on top management experience and knowledge. Another 70 focused on conversations with their sales teams. They did not, unfortunately, focus on what you might call external or market level kind of input, like discussions with their partners, quick research with customers, even learning from their competition or companies in other industries that they weren't competing with. All of those were sort of in the 50s, 40s, 50s%, as opposed to sort of on the 80%. So I think there was a missed opportunity. I understand why companies probably did turn inward because there was a lot of uncertainty. But using things like website analytics to judge what was happening with consumers, trying to figure out what was going on in terms of, how were companies in very different industries working to resolve their uncertainty. There was probably an opportunity here. And I would point people to the San Antonio-based retailer, a supermarket, the chain HEB, because and there's a very nice article about them that you can look up, because they were very very forward-looking. First, in their preparation, they had a pandemic plan, and then when things started to get rough, even as early as January, they were in touch with Chinese retailers. They were in touch with Italian retailers to try to learn as much as they could, as quickly as they could, about what they might do to prepare themselves for what was coming. So I think that's something to think about. Okay. What about experimentation? What about experimentation? Did marketers engage in any more experimentation during the pandemic? This is a question from Christoph. That's a good question, because we talked about improvisation. So we see that at a pretty high level on this 7-point scale, about a 5.7. But in fact, experimentation actually dropped. It dropped from the February survey. So I think we expected that to rise up during the pandemic as marketers were trying different things, but they really didn't. So you might say, well, maybe they moved too fast for experimentation. You might say that they turned inward and didn't think about experimentation. But we know that that number actually did not increase. And in fact, I'll just share with you one statistic that I have here, which is that only 29% of marketers report investing resources in research and experimentation capabilities. So that number is probably smaller than we might have expected during this difficult time. Okay, I think we have maybe time for one more question. So we have a question here about customer experience. Christian is asking, given the post-crisis customer behaviors. That's a good question, Christian. I think if you look in the survey report, you'll see that spending on customer experience did go up. And what's important there is, I think, for marketers to think about, what that looks like digitally, and how we reach and touch, and also going back to that trust point, how we really engender a trusting relationship through the customer experience investments that we make in our digital tools. And so yeah, that number did go up. And so I think that that's probably all that we have for today. I just want to say to you that you should please feel free to do a couple things. First, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate the opportunity to see many of you, and I'll look for your comments as they come in. You can feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions. If you do have questions about any of the specifics, please feel free to look at those reports. Please sign up to participate in the survey if you qualify, or encourage somebody within your company to participate. A few other reminders: please join Cam Harvey, a professor in the finance area, who will be hosting this series next week. He's going to be talking about the risks in the economic recovery, and I'm sure he'll have a lot of important insights to share. And don't forget to follow Fuqua on LinkedIn so that you can stay in touch with all of the activities that we have going on here at the school. Thank you very much.